if you feel lonely, I could be lonely with you. Tell me, baby, why do you seem so blue? Why are we so complicated? Maybe love is over.
It was a moment in time that almost ended it all for the human race. The ultimate game of brinksmanship. This is the story of the Cuban Missile Crisis. 1962, Cuba. The Soviet Union has been welcomed with open arms by the Fidel Castro regime. Seen as a guarantor of Cuban independence from the United States, the Cuban-Soviet alliance is vital for Castro and a strategic coup for the Soviet Union. With Miami only 80 miles away, Cuba gives the Soviets air bases and naval facilities from which to do something no foreign power has been able to do in over 150 years, threaten the American homeland. But Nikita Khrushchev, premier of the Soviet Union, has not taken full advantage of the strategic importance offered by Cuba. Much to Castro's chagrin, Khrushchev knows two things. First, the Soviet Navy is unlikely to be able to support Soviet forces so far from their own shores if facing down the American Navy. And second, the presence of large Soviet military forces 80 miles from the US would be an extreme provocation that's unlikely to remain unanswered. This is why it comes as such a surprise to many senior Soviet leaders when Khrushchev approves a plan to station nuclear weapons in Cuba. If military forces would be a provocation, this is tantamount to a declaration of war. The plan must be carried out in complete secrecy. Khrushchev's goal is to set up several dozen nuclear-capable missiles on Cuba and then reveal their existence to American President John F. Kennedy. He'll use the presence of the missiles as leverage to gain several concessions from the U.S. in return, chiefly the removal of American nuclear missiles in Turkey and possibly even the evacuation of West Berlin by NATO forces. If Khrushchev can catch Kennedy by surprise, Kennedy will have no choice but to agree to the demands or face down the threat of nuclear missiles capable of reaching Washington in 10 minutes or less. But American intelligence has kept an expansive spy ring alive and well in Cuba. Many Cuban citizens may not have liked the Batista dictatorship supported by the U.S., but they like Castro and communism even less. Rumors circulate about a large influx of Soviet military personnel disguised as agriculture experts and civil engineers. Movement of Soviet equipment across the island has been spotted and reported to American field agents, who relay the information back to their handlers on the mainland. The intelligence community is convinced there are Soviet nuclear weapons in Cuba, but nobody else believes them. They must gather evidence. On October 14, 1962, a U-2 spy plane is piloted by Major Richard Heiser and takes off from an airfield in Florida and heads for Cuba. Flying at extreme heights, the plane is difficult to target with ground-based weapons, and Cuban radar operators aren't as alert as they should be. The plane takes thousands of photographs of suspected Soviet military sites on the island before returning home. The film roll, over 3 miles in length, is rushed to be analyzed by intelligence specialists. The specialists have been cooperating with experts in Soviet nuclear missile sites, and with their knowledge confirm the presence of several sites on Cuba which look exactly like known nuclear sites in the USSR. The greatest existential threat the United States has ever faced has just been confirmed. As the news is rushed to President Kennedy, the Soviets continue their work. They cover their launchers with camouflage netting during the day and work strictly at night to avoid detection. Khrushchev monitors their progress carefully. If the missiles can remain undetected in just over a week, they'll be active, and he'll have achieved the greatest strategic victory in Russian history. October 16th, President John F. Kennedy has called an immediate meeting of XCOM, a team of his most senior advisors and Pentagon officials. The photos are analyzed and scrutinized. American intelligence confirms the locations of the missiles brought to Cuba aboard Soviet freighters and carefully hidden from public view during the transit. Kennedy asks just how long it'll take for the missiles to be active. Estimates vary, but most agree it'll take just over a week. The president needs options, and he needs them fast. Air Force Chief of Staff General Curtis LeMay, the legendary World War II Bulldog bomber commander, has an immediate answer. "Bomb the sumbitches," he responds. The United States has the largest strategic bomber fleet in the world, the missile sites in a matter of hours. The other military advisors in the room agree with LeMay, strongly favoring immediate military action. The U.S. Marines, supported by the Navy and Army, can have a foothold in Cuba with just a few days prep time. The missiles, Castro, and the Soviets could all be out of the Western Hemisphere by the end of the week. Kennedy's non-military advisors are horrified, and Kennedy shares their objections. A military strike would kill thousands of Soviet personnel and risk escalating the conflict. Khrushchev would be likely to take retaliatory action in Germany, particularly against West Berlin, where 15,000 NATO forces are surrounded by over 100,000 Eastern Bloc forces. The heated argument lasts for hours, and finally Kennedy is given three options: an air attack and possible invasion of Cuba, diplomacy with Castro and Khrushchev, or a naval quarantine of the island. Kennedy immediately takes to the quarantine idea, though is careful to phrase it as a quarantine and not a blockade that would technically be considered an act of war. However, Kennedy needs more time to prepare the U.S. Navy and to consider how to execute the quarantine. Soviet ships frequently travel to the island nation, and he needs to mull the decision over. He knows the Soviets may call his bluff, and American seamen may be forced to fire on Soviet ships with unknown repercussions. To the rest of the world, the American government seems to be pursuing business as usual. Soviet intelligence is confident that the U.S. still doesn't know about the missiles. Congressional elections are coming up shortly, and Kennedy goes on the campaign trail for fellow Democrats, acting as if everything is perfectly fine. Behind the scenes, though, the U.S. military is preparing for conflict. America's silent service, its fleet of submarines, begin a hunt for Soviet ballistic missile subs and then shadow them. In the case of war, they'll be sunk before having a chance to fire. American journalists, however, are beginning to grow suspicious. Leaks from within the White House have led to rumors of imminent military action against Cuba. The rumors, completely unsubstantiated, then begin to hint at the presence of nuclear weapons on the island. A Washington correspondent spots a dinner meeting of senior military leadership and Cuban policy experts and presses for answers, but the men refuse to answer. One major editorial finally has enough evidence to go to press with a bombshell story about Soviet weapons in Cuba, and President Kennedy himself personally asks the editor of the paper to not publish the story. The editor agrees, giving Kennedy more time to prepare his response. Kennedy leaves the campaign trail in order to meet with senior advisors, and at a daily press briefing, reporters demand to know if rumors that the president returned to Washington to discuss a military matter of great significance are true. The White House press secretary assures the reporters that the president was simply suffering from a worsening cold. The Soviets, however, are growing suspicious that their weapons have been made by the Americans. Their fears are confirmed when, on the morning of October 22nd, the White House press secretary announces that the president will address all Americans on a matter of vital national importance that very evening. As the sun sets across America, President John F. Kennedy addresses the United States and the world over television and radio. The president confirms the presence of Soviet nuclear weapons on Cuba, as well as the assembling of Soviet strategic bombers and the creation of support airfields. He lambasts the Soviet Union for lying about the defensive nature of the military buildup on the island. Kennedy then announces a naval quarantine of the island, stating that any ships discovered to be carrying weapons will be turned back, and the quarantine will be strictly enforced. He also makes it clear that any nuclear weapons launched against any target in the Western Hemisphere will be considered an act of war against the United States itself. Thousands of miles away, Khrushchev and his cabinet pay close attention to Kennedy's speech. Khrushchev is actually greatly relieved. He had expected and had been preparing for military action. However, Kennedy's quarantine is a clear signal that he's willing to negotiate. That night, Khrushchev sends his own signal to Washington by attending the opera where an American performer is currently headlining. He meets with the American, and together they discuss peace. But the fate of the world may be out of the hands of the two men whose militaries are preparing to go to war against each other, and in the hands of those very soldiers. Back in the U.S., the American Navy is steaming into position around Cuba and closing the cordon. With 20 ships already on their way from the Soviet Union, tensions are sky high. Standing orders are to issue radio warnings to turn back. If any ship refuses, a single warning shot across the bow will be fired. If the ship still refuses to turn back, American ships are authorized to fire in order to disable the ship. Still, several hundred miles out, the Soviet ships, however, are not showing any signs of stopping or turning around, further ratcheting tensions. The American secret SOSUS underwater surveillance program confirms the presence of Soviet submarines moving into the Caribbean. Back in Washington, an American reporter is getting a drink at a bar and chatting with a friend. He remarks that he's soon to be attached to a Marine landing force. The bartender overhears the chatter and moves down the bar to where a Soviet reporter is drinking. The bartender taunts the Soviet, telling him that soon the U.S. will be invading Cuba. The Soviet is not just a prominent reporter, though, he's a KGB agent. The next day, the Soviet ambassador meets with the American reporter and over dinner attempts to pump him for information about a possible invasion of Cuba. The reporter simply warns the ambassador not to underestimate the resolve of the U.S. October 25th, the Eastern Caribbean. Soviet freighters full of arms are approaching the quarantine zone. They've ignored all warnings to turn back. American ships sound battle stations, but at the last minute the ships suddenly change course and sail back for Europe. The oil tanker Bucharest, however, refuses to turn back. American captains are under orders not to fire without express authorization from the president himself. Kennedy is informed of the tanker's refusal. His advisors warn him that if they allow the tanker through, it'll only encourage other Soviet ships to break the quarantine as well. Kennedy decides to risk it and allows the tanker to dock in Cuba. The next day, Fidel Castro sends a letter to Khrushchev imploring him to launch a nuclear first strike against the US. He's willing to sacrifice his island and his people for the cause of global revolution if it means the US will also burn in flames. Khrushchev ignores the letter and writes one of his own to Kennedy, penning a strong emotional appeal for both sides to find a peaceful resolution and not doom the world to the catastrophe of thermonuclear war. Kennedy receives the letter and considers it. It poses great political risk for both sides. If the letter is leaked, Khrushchev could appear weak to the Soviet people and his allies. If Kennedy takes the letter at face value and it turns out to be nothing more than a manipulative ploy, Kennedy could appear extremely naive. Back in Cuba, the Americans are now keeping tabs on the progress of the missile buildup with the use of U-2 spy planes. The planes are detected by Cuban radar, but the anti-air missiles are under the command of Soviet units. Soviet forces are under strict orders not to fire without Kremlin authorization. October 27th. High in the sky over Cuba, an American U-2 is flying a reconnaissance mission. Major Rudolph Anderson has been detected and tracked by Cuban radar. Soviet missiles have a good lock on the American plane. Inexplicably, the Soviet ground commander gives the order to fire. A telephone pole-sized missile streaks up to the sky. In minutes, it explodes under the belly of the U-2, tearing it into pieces. Shrapnel from the explosion rips through the cockpit, fatally wounding Major Anderson. The first shot of World War III may have just been fired. Unknown to the Soviets, the White House had already decided even before the U-2 took flight that if it was shot down, they wouldn't even meet. A military response would be immediately launched. What the Americans don't know, however, is that Soviet strategic nuclear weapons are already operational and more than capable of annihilating an American invasion force. Luckily for the world, the White House goes back on their original plan and decides to meet and discuss the incident instead of launching a military strike. As the Americans debate their response, however, yet another provocation is about to launch global thermonuclear war. Soviet submarines have been tracked by the Americans across the Caribbean, and now one has been detected loitering near the quarantine zone. Soviet Foxtrot-class submarine B-59 has been running deep and silent in order to avoid the American Navy, but its batteries are nearly exhausted. It's now loitering on the surface and running its diesel engines in order to recharge onboard batteries when the crew spot two American destroyers streaming directly at them. The captain calls for an emergency crash dive, and the sub gets under the waves just a minute before the Americans arrive. The two destroyers begin dropping practice depth charges around the submarine's location. These charges are used in training and contain little explosive charge and are meant to signal to the submarine that it must surface. However, the Soviet crew don't know that the US is dropping training charges, and to make matters worse, they've been out of radio contact with Moscow for days due to their need to run deep and silent. When they surfaced, they'd been monitoring US civilian radio for signs of how the crisis was playing out. The submarines fear that the war has already broken out. Unknown to the Americans above, the B-59 is equipped with a nuclear-tipped torpedo. And believing that they're under attack and war had broken out, Captain Valentin Savitsky and political officer Ivan Semyonovich Maslenikov both approve launch of the nuclear torpedo. However, Vasily Arkhipov, commander of the submarine flotilla B-59 is a part of, does not give his consent. On any other Soviet submarine, only two officers must give consent, but with Arkhipov aboard, all three must agree. The launch is aborted, and the B-59 surfaces to re-establish contact with Moscow. Nuclear war is once more just barely avoided. On October 28th, Khrushchev concedes to Kennedy's demands that the missiles be withdrawn. The American ambassador has already informed him that American missiles in Turkey were going to be removed anyway, but the plan couldn't be made public. Kennedy and Khrushchev have come to an agreement. The missiles in Cuba will be removed, and America will remove its own missiles from Turkey. The apparent concession by the US gives Khrushchev just enough to save face in front of the Politburo. But there still doesn't exist a direct line between Moscow and Washington, and sending a telegraph could take hours. Meanwhile, US and Soviet forces are still playing an extremely dangerous cat-and-mouse game under the Caribbean. Any minute now, yet another trigger-happy soldier could inadvertently launch the end of the world. Khrushchev orders that news of his agreement be broadcast over public radio, as that will be the fastest way to get words to the Americans and immediately stand down all forces. An official staff vehicle speeds across Moscow to reach a broadcast center before another accident triggers war. All traffic lights on the route are switched to green as the car roars through the streets, finally arriving at its destination. However, on the elevator ride up to the broadcast booth, the elevator becomes stuck. To the horror of the Kremlin staffer clutching Khrushchev's letter to Kennedy, the elevator may take hours to be repaired. In despair, he manages to force the letter through a gap in the elevator doors and into the hands of a messenger boy who holds the very fate of the world in his hands. The message is at last successfully broadcast and picked up by radios all across the world. The Cuban Missile Crisis is officially over, and the U.S. closely monitors the removal of Soviet weapons from Cuba. 8 months later, as promised, U.S. missiles are removed from Turkey. Against all odds, the world has narrowly avoided nuclear